All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. Check out great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries. And today is our 235th Bible Decode, coming from the New Testament and exploring every angle of the Roman origins hypothesis, which is really a game changer for New Testament studies. That is, that the New Testament was written in its entirety by the Roman Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, not by some illiterate Aramaic-speaking apostles in Judea, but by the Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking Roman elite living at Caesar's palace in Rome during the Flavian dynasty from 69 to 96 AD. That's Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And they wrote the Gospels, and eventually the epistles were also written as a psychological operation against the Jews. The New Testament is a psyop. It's the greatest psyop in history, and still has not been detected, but the proof is all there, and I've outlined that. I've gone over all of it in previous videos, but I'll just outline a little bit here today. The reason why the Romans wanted to psyop the Jews is because the Jews had been a big pain in the butt for the Romans for over 100 years, culminating in the War of the Jews between the Romans and the Jews, 66 to 73 AD. Emperor Vespasian and Emperor Titus were both generals at that time in the war, and both were wounded in the war. But that war was just the culmination of many revolts and uprisings and insurrections and riots and terrorist attacks and assassinations that the Romans had to deal with from the Jews ever since the Romans took over in 63 BC. The Jews had a very separatist, xenophobic mindset with their jealous and zealous God, who was addicted to smoking animal fat and a number of other quirky, idiosyncratic personality disorders that led to the Jews having so many different rituals. The God's obsessive compulsive disorder leading to all the Levitican, all of the instructions in Exodus 12 about the Passover lamb and how everything's supposed to be done, and the Jews had to follow all of it. And the Romans were, somewhat ambivalent, but it made the Romans' job much more difficult. And then when the Romans, tried to implement something, the Jews showed that they were really willing to die rather than to give up their traditions and rituals. And the Jews were waiting for a Messiah that had been prophesied in the Old Testament in a number of different places. A Messiah who was going to come up and overthrow the Romans, in this case. Before that, it was the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greek Syrians and then the Romans. And the Romans wanted to nip that in the bud. They actually failed to nip it in the bud because that whole war was due to the fact that three self-proclaimed messiahs, Jewish messiahs, rose up to fight against the Herod puppet kings of Jerusalem, and they kicked out Herod Agrippa II, sent him packing back to Rome, at least briefly, until Emperor Nero, sent in the military with General Vespasian. And Vespasian was there for 3 years, and then Titus was there for 3+ years. So it took them almost 7 years to get to finally vanquish the Jews. Vespasian became emperor then in 69, and he turned over the military to his son Titus. So that was basically the motive for the Romans, to tame or to domesticate the Jews. They used a lot of kind of horticultural language, botany language, in their kind of coded language of what they were trying to do. They were also trying to graft themselves onto the Jewish lineage. Now, the way they did it is they wrote the Gospels, backdated the story by 40 years, and then they also wrote a history of this war called War of the Jews. They wrote that under the name of Josephus, who may have been a real person, but whoever he was, maybe a team of people, whoever he was, he emanated from Caesar's palace in Rome. The story was that Josephus was a Jewish military commander in this war who surrendered to Vespasian, defected to the Romans, predicted Vespasian would one day become emperor, and when he did, Vespasian pardoned him, brought him to Rome as one of the new court historians, and set him up at Caesar's palace in a townhouse and adopted him into his family, such that he was now known as Flavius Josephus. So we know Flavius Josephus as an agent of the Flavians. Flavian, by the way, means blonde or golden. The Romans also fit their MO completely. They created other religions in the first century for psychological purposes as well. They had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. They were the only people who had censorship ability in the Roman Empire. They also had the ability to publish, and including, having stables of slave scribes to copy texts over and over and again. And they had the only postal service in the Roman Empire, so they were the only people that could have distributed the Gospels like they were. Also, the Gospels, again, are written in Greek, as is Josephus, which is one of the two main languages of Rome, much more rare in Judea. They would have been speaking Aramaic and writing not very much, because illiteracy was much higher in Judea than in Rome. Now, the more objective evidence is when you start to take Josephus's War of the Jews and read it side by side with the Gospels, in particular the book of Luke. Joseph Atwill noticed that the military campaign of Titus, as discussed in War of the Jews, was a model for the 3-year ministry of Jesus in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes. And they go to these various locations in the same order. They participate in parallel events at each location that are separated by 40 years in time. And we're talking about over 40 separate events in the same order in both books. Michael Menescot's, in his book called Christianity's origin as a Flavian secrecy cult, noticed even more parallels in the book of Luke. He found over 250 just in the book of Luke, and meaning that the book of Luke is utterly saturated with parallels. Some of them are highly detailed and intricate, that required a great deal of conscious construction on the part of the Romans. And they also fit a pattern that Menescot's discovered when he graphed the parallels. He put the book of Luke on one axis, War of the Jews on the other axis, and discovered that when he plotted the 250 plus points, they made 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, APTVS. Latin being the other language spoken by the Caesars of Rome. In other words, the Romans not only wrote the book of Luke, but they signed their name to the book of Luke, or at least put their initials on the book of Luke, in order that you would one day discover the real truth about this. The Roman origins hypothesis has incredibly large amount of explanatory power. And also another theme, and it shows just the general mean-spiritedness and ridiculing and mocking manner of the Romans. And it's pretty unbridled in its anti-Semitism, but you don't really notice it if you're not looking for it. Or at least the world has not noticed it up until now. But if you pay attention, you know, the Jews are waiting for a Messiah. And so the Romans proposed a Messiah. But instead of being a military commander, this Messiah was a Prince of Peace. And he believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack and turning the other cheek to oppression, while at the same time taking direct aim at the Jewish traditions when he overturned the tables of the money changers and excoriated the Jewish merchants who were selling small animals for the sacrifice. And throughout, Jesus is utterly deferential toward Rome and utterly critical of the Jews, and in particular their rituals. And then the epistles of Paul are even more stark in that direction, almost as if they were written by the Romans. And more people are discovering this. We are looking at a book here that was written by Thies Voskuilen and Rosemary Sheldon that scratches the surface of the Roman origins hypothesis, but is not prepared to go all the way there. It's called Operation Messiah, and it argues that Paul was an intelligence agent of the Romans. Which makes sense, but it just doesn't go far enough. They notice how strange it is for Paul to be, basically pro-Roman and anti-Jew. And the problem is that they don't notice that Jesus is the same thing, but just not to such an extent. And had they made that leap, which they show that they are on nearly making that leap. They cited the book of John in the reading from yesterday, which got into a lot of the anti-Semitism that is expressed in the book of John, but they don't quite make that connection with the rest of the Gospels. But anyway, we're going to take over here in Operation Messiah and kind of see what questions they ask and see what kind of evidence is presented for the Roman origins hypothesis that they just don't quite make the connection for. There are many unanswered questions connected with Paul's trial and later departure for Rome. Why did he need a trial if all the authorities, including King Agrippa, thought he was innocent? Why would the Romans waste all that money and manpower on yet another trial? Why would they bother the government in Rome? Did everyone in Rome and Caesarea drop the subject, or did they make attempts to pursue Paul? Did the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem send messages to Rome warning of Paul's arrival? Acts shows Paul preaching to the most knowledgeable, informed, and important representatives of the Jewish population in Rome. If this were true, they would have seen him for what he was. Acts says some Jews were convinced and some were not. If they had any connection with Jerusalem at all, they would have recognized that Paul was not in good standing with those people. The predominant impression left about the entire trial narrative is that there is much more to the story than we are being told. Well, actually, there's much less because the entire story is fiction. So whatever's not there, wasn't there, isn't there on purpose, and because none of it ever happened. But if you want to insist upon only staying with Paul being the intelligence agent, then you have all these loose ends that you can't tie up. If this whole story has not been fabricated, the amount of attention paid to the case by the Roman authorities is extraordinary, and Paul's release strongly suggests his Roman connections. Okay, that is the end of that chapter. Gotta scroll through the footnotes. One day I'd like to read these footnotes, but I'm boring enough as is. Okay, now we're on chapter 9, which is called Paul in Rome. Around the year 59 AD, the Roman authorities in Palestine decided that Paul should have an opportunity to prove his innocence, which was not disputed by the authorities in Caesarea, in front of the emperor of Rome. The story of Paul's transfer from Caesarea to Rome is one of the most exciting tales in Acts. The shipwreck, the sojourn in Malta, and the voyage in Puteoli are all very vivid. The question of whether Paul's seafaring adventures actually took place has been dealt with at length elsewhere. The use of a voyage, whether real or imaginary, to provide the essential structure for a narrative is one of the oldest plot devices in literature. Some have argued that the description of the journey was made up of elements existing stories into which the author of Acts inserted his narrative of Paul as an instrument of God. If this were the case, it would serve to suggest once more that some people still doubted Paul's truthfulness and the legitimacy of his message, and that those skeptics needed to be convinced. This does not mean that Paul could not have been aboard a ship during his travels and experienced some rough weather, but it does point to a tale that might have been partly constructed to shed a particular light on its hero, rather than to describe historical facts accurately. Now, I'd like to point out that in Josephus's War of the Jews, there is also a shipwreck scene, and a very similar story, to the point where some authors, including Ralph Ellis, have suggested that Paul and Josephus were the same person, and that they both experienced this thing on the ship. Now, that's, I believe, because Ellis doesn't quite recognize the whole Roman origins hypothesis, even though he comes very close to pointing to it. But he doesn't recognize that Paul is fiction, and that the actions of Paul never happened, and the actions in Josephus may not have happened either. But there are a lot of parallels, and there's a lot of numerology that's also involved in this shipwreck, which is also discussed by Joseph Atwill in his book Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. But anyway, they say all we can assume is that Paul went to Rome on board a ship. Paul was accompanied by Roman soldiers. Paul arrived in Rome. Paul stayed in Rome in his own rented house while spreading his version of Jesus' message. We will assume these four basic historical givens to be true only because there seems to be no good reason for the writer of Acts to have invented them all. Well, I just recounted a lot of pretty good reasons for the writer of Acts to have invented them, because they were a psychological operation from the Romans against the Jews. And so your four assumptions are not the kind of thing that really historians do, only when they completely lack evidence. You know, he says, we will assume these four basic historical givens to be true. That is not what a historian does. Okay, now this section is called Paul Sails for Rome, 59 AD. Acts describes the preparation for Paul's journey from Caesarea to Rome as follows. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. The details of the travel are left entirely to this centurion Julius, who is described by some as a speculator, one of Rome's spies. The manner of conveyance was Julius's choice, but the route taken, the ports of call, and the speed of progress would have been determined by the weather as much as by military considerations. This officer presumably carried the letters of report that he would deliver to the authorities in Rome. Some believe the boat Paul traveled on was a government vessel, or that it was part of the imperial fleet. Others suggest it was an Alexandrian grain carrier. If it were a government vessel, this would again support a theory about Paul's government connections. I find it kind of odd that they have not mentioned that there is a shipwreck of the exact same type in the book War of the Jews by Josephus. You know, especially given that the Gospels and Josephus are really our only two major historical sources for information about the first century, and that they both have a corresponding story. Anyway, we know little of the custodial facilities in which Paul was supposedly kept aboard ship on the way to Rome. Under normal circumstances, prisoners paid for their own food when they were in transit as well as in prison. Did Paul pay his own expenses and for the passage of his friends? We do not know. Most passengers on ancient ships camped on deck, living either in the open or under tiny temporary shelters. There were also steerage accommodations in the bowels of the ship. For prisoners, the journey could be much more difficult. They might be tied to the crossbeams of the ship or chained below. The conditions during Paul's custody aboard ship seem amazingly free. He was able to address the ship's crew, the centurion, and his compatriots, as well as the other passengers, with ease. If he can see the attempt being made by certain sailors in the bow area to abandon ship during a storm, then he is clearly above deck. His conditions do not seem to change from the first two vessels in which he travels to the Alexandrian grain vessel mentioned in Acts 28:11. Most people imagine Paul being sent to Rome in chains. One scholar even suggests he was chained to the centurion himself, although why the centurion would endure this is unclear. The 3 days of hospitality offered to all by the Maltese official Publius in Acts 28:7, the bed and board given by the people of Malta over 3 months, and the 7-day stay in the homes of Christians at Puteoli suggest that Paul, his companions, and his keepers all traveled in normal style and without much hardship. One of his companions was the only person present at Paul's departure from Palestine, Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. We know next to nothing about him. He had appeared before in Acts in connection with the riot at Ephesus in Acts 19:29 and the Jerusalem connection at Acts 24. He might be the same person mentioned in Colossians 4:10 and Philemon 24. In Colossians 4:10, Paul calls him his fellow prisoner. We do not know how this Aristarchus met Paul, what he did before his involvement with Paul, how he made his money, who his friends were, why he was released from prison, if he was ever in prison, or what his political loyalties were. Some have suggested that Luke and Aristarchus traveled as Paul's slaves. Why anyone should think this legal fiction would fool the Roman authorities is unclear. The Roman centurion Julius also allowed Paul to see anonymous friends whom Paul appears to have and sit on. It seems that the Romans were not curious at all to get to know these friends of Paul's, even though Paul was allegedly a messianist dissident and leader of a persecuted movement. Instead, judging by the text, the soldiers appear to have remained at a distance and allowed these friends to cater to some of Paul's needs. There is no mention of the Roman military identifying these friends, talking to them, let alone arresting them. It is somewhat difficult to imagine that the Roman military did not even try to identify the dissidents' friends if they really considered Paul to be a potential threat to the public order. The centurion wanted to spare Paul's life after the shipwreck that brought them to Malta. Some have suggested it was because Julius was so impressed with the nautical insights Paul had displayed in Acts 27, the second half of Acts 27. The soldiers under Julius's command, however, did not seem to have been as impressed with Paul as their centurion was, since they wanted to kill the prisoner. An alternative explanation for the centurion's order to spare Paul's life, despite his soldiers' wishes, is that the centurion knew of Paul's special status, which had been kept a secret from the others aboard ship. If the centurion was a speculator, then he and Paul were in the same business. This might be a more rational explanation than alleged soft-heartedness. And this is a pretty blurry word. Than alleged soft-heartedness and I'm sorry. I can't read that word. And something on the part of an accomplished Roman military officer who at the time was under immense stress to have his own life and the lives of his soldiers and prisoners, to save his own life and the lives of his soldiers and prisoners. It does not seem very likely that an officer of Julius's rank would be swayed by personal emotions on an official government mission and risk his career or the lives of Roman personnel on board over an alleged Jewish deserter and messianist dissident. After all, if everyone on board needed to get to safety using planks and other improvised floating devices, allowing the prisoners to grab hold of some of them might have reduced the chances of survival for the soldiers and the centurion. The centurion would have needed a very good reason to do what he did. In this account, everyone made it ashore alive, but had that not been the case, the centurion would have needed a much better explanation for risking the lives of his soldiers than that he was impressed with Paul's advice on how to sail a ship. Acts goes on to say that once on shore in Malta, quote, the islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood and, as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, this man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and for 3 days entertained us hospitably. That's all in Acts 27 and the beginning of 28. Again, we see a high-ranking government official treating